Hollywood films love to show us the romance of medieval castles in winter, where lords drink mulled wine by huge, cozy fireplaces. We look at these majestic stone halls and think that the lives of the nobility were filled with nothing but luxury and comfort.
But here's an interesting fact that filmmakers prefer to tactfully keep quiet about.
Real winter in a medieval fortress was not a winter fairy tale, but a brutal test of physical survival. Forget about enemy armies, sieges, or poisoned daggers of hired assassins in dark corridors. Your own home tried to kill you every single day with cold, smoke, rotten food, and parasites. Let's start with the simplest and most banal desire of any person: to warm up on a frosty evening.
It seems logical to light a fire, but fireplaces with normal chimneys did not appear in castles right away.
For a long time, fires were lit in huge iron braziers right in the middle of the living quarters. Sounds like a questionable design decision, doesn't it? But the lords simply had no other options for getting even a little warmth in the icy hall. And this is where the most frightening and interesting part begins. To preserve what little heat there was, servants closed all the wooden shutters on the windows and locked the doors tightly. Why did they do this? Because the icy draft seemed to them a more immediate and obvious threat than invisible gas. They literally turned the luxurious lord's chambers into a real gas chamber with their own hands. The fire slowly burned up the oxygen, replacing it with deadly carbon monoxide in a completely sealed room. People went to bed hoping to warm up, and in the morning they simply did not wake up. Modern science calls this carbon monoxide poisoning, and to protect ourselves from it, we install smart detectors in our homes. In the Middle Ages, there were no detectors, so entire families could quietly die in their sleep. It was not a bloody battle, it was a quiet, invisible death in their own beds.
My head starts to ache just thinking about sleeping in a room like that.
Today, you would immediately call the emergency services if your bedroom filled with smoke from a fire. But they considered it a sign of luxury because the poor didn't even have such braziers. But even if a person did not die immediately, their lungs were subjected to the most severe daily torture. Imagine breathing thick, acrid wood smoke 24 hours a day for 5 months. Have you ever sat too close to a fire when the wind is blowing directly in your face? Now, multiply that discomfort by an entire winter without the possibility of getting some fresh air. The castle's inhabitants developed severe chronic respiratory diseases, which modern medicine diagnoses in minors. The funny thing is that this affected the richest and most powerful people of their time. Your title and chests of gold did nothing to protect your lungs from toxic soot. Modern doctors would be horrified to see x-rays of a medieval duke's lungs. All this luxurious life within stone walls was in fact a slow suicide by suffocation. You spend a fortune building an impregnable fortress, and it slowly suffocates you from within. Even when fireplaces were finally invented, they worked terribly and smoked right into the hall.
The draft was weak, the stone pipes quickly clogged with soot, and the smoke still came back.
So why did they build them at all? Because it was the cutting-edge technology of the time, the equivalent of modern climate control. Only this climate control regularly spewed clouds of toxic smoke right onto your expensive tapestries. And do you know what is most surprising about this whole carbon monoxide situation? It is how well the human body can adapt to absolutely unbearable environmental conditions. Their bodies tried to compensate for the lack of oxygen by producing more red blood cells, just like modern mountaineers. Today, athletes train in the mountains to achieve this effect and increase their endurance. A medieval lord simply had to sit in his living room until spring. But adaptation had its limits, and by the end of winter, people became lethargic and weak. Chronic oxygen deprivation slowed down their brain function and made them extremely vulnerable to other diseases. Do you think they felt like powerful rulers during those dark winter months? In reality, they were more like half-dead shadows coughing soot in the dim light, and that was only the first line of defense that winter built against them. It seems crazy that the greatest architects of the time couldn't come up with a decent ventilation system, but engineering developed slowly, through trial and error and extremely painful mistakes.
Centering, Master. It might.
Every technical innovation in the castle was paid for with the lives of those who tested it on themselves. So the next time you complain about central heating, remember these guys. They would have given half their kingdom for your radiator, which doesn't try to kill them with carbon monoxide. If the smoke didn't kill you, medieval cooking came into play, namely the main product on the table. By the middle of winter, the supply of good, high-quality wheat in the pantries was inevitably coming to an end. Rye came into play, which was cheaper and more durable, but held a terrible surprise. This grain was extremely susceptible to ergot, a parasitic fungus that thrived in the damp storage rooms of castles. Sounds like a common agricultural problem, right? But in reality, it was a biological time bomb. Eating bread made from this flour caused a disease that we now call ergotism. In the Middle Ages, no one understood the chemical composition of fungi, so the disease was given a mystical name, St. Anthony's fire. Why fire? Because ergot toxins cause blood vessels to constrict, leading to gangrene and unbearable burning in the limbs. People literally felt their arms and legs burning alive from the inside. Modern medicine knows that ergot contains alkaloids related to LSD. Therefore, in addition to physical pain, poisoned people experience powerful, uncontrollable, and very frightening hallucinations.
Imagine a garrison of tough soldiers who suddenly start seeing demons right in their barracks.
This is not a horror movie scenario. It was a normal February in a medieval castle. They defended the walls from the external enemy, while the internal enemy drove them mad. But it gets even more interesting, because no one linked these torments to their daily rations. People sincerely believed that this was a curse from God or the result of black magic performed by witches. They prayed fervently, fasted, and continued to eat the same contaminated black bread every day. It was like treating food poisoning by washing down pills with spoiled milk. The vicious circle of ignorance killed the inhabitants of the castles more effectively than any catapult. Sometimes entire garrisons died of ergotism, leaving the fortresses completely defenseless against real enemies. You could bring an army to the walls and find that the defenders had already been destroyed by their own baker. It is a striking historical paradox. The castle's life support system became its main executioner. Today, any health inspector would shut down such a kitchen the moment they inspected it. But back then, the cook proudly served this poisonous loaf to the Lord himself. Of course, the lords suffered less often because they tried to eat white wheat bread until the very end. But by March, even their granaries could contain contaminated, low-quality flour. And then the great commander would suddenly lose his toes to gangrene without any combat injuries. Doctors of the time tried to treat this with bloodletting, which only further weakened the weakened body. It sounds like mockery, but it was the pinnacle of medical thought in those years. Interestingly, modern pharmacologists use ergot derivatives to create migraine medications. Scientists took a medieval nightmare and turned it into a useful medical tool. But ancient people received a wild, uncontrolled dose of toxin right at breakfast. Your morning toast simply gives you energy, but their morning bread could cost them their limbs. Think about that the next time you go to the bakery for a fresh baguette. The scale of the problem was such that entire monastic orders were created to help the sick. The Order of St. Anthony specialized in caring for victims of this terrible food poisoning. They couldn't cure them, but at least they offered clean food, which paradoxically stopped the poisoning. The patient stopped eating the contaminated castle rations and magically got better. The monks considered it a miracle, when in fact it was simply a change in diet.
So winter in the castle turned into a real game of roulette, with daily meals.
Every piece of bread could be a ticket to the madhouse or to the table of the butcher surgeon. This makes our modern complaints about gluten or stale pastries seem a little ridiculous. Survival depended on how well the grain had dried in the barn the previous summer. And this uncertainty hung over the inhabitants of the fortress like a cold sword of Damocles. Let's say you were lucky and your bread turned out fine, but then the Lord's winter diet came into play. Their diet consisted of huge amounts of salted meat, old lard, hard cheese, and wine. It sounds like the menu of a respectable modern steakhouse, only without side dishes and salads. And it was precisely this no salads that was the reason for the next deadly threat to the inhabitants of the stronghold. Their food was completely, absolutely devoid of fresh vegetables, greens, and fruits. Because of this total shortage, by the end of winter, the castle was inevitably hit by a wave of scurvy. We are used to associating scurvy with sailors who sailed across the ocean for months on wooden ships.
The gods bless you, brother.
But the winter castle was just like a ship, only made of stone and stuck in the middle of the snow. The inhabitants of the fortress were as isolated from fresh food as sailors on the open sea, and their bodies began to react to the acute lack of vitamin C in exactly the same terrible way. At first, you just feel incredibly tired, which you attribute to the winter blues and short days. But then your gums start to bleed, and your teeth become loose and fall out while you're eating. Modern dentists call collagen the building glue of our body, and vitamin C is necessary for its synthesis. Without this vitamin, your body literally begins to fall apart on the go. And this happened to the strongest and most trained knights of that time. It gets worse. Old battle scars and wounds that had long since healed suddenly reopen. Imagine a veteran whose 10-year-old sword scar suddenly starts bleeding again. It sounds like a necromancer's curse, but it's pure biology and biochemistry of collagen breakdown. Immunity dropped so low that any accidental scratch from a splinter turned into a deadly blood infection.
You could survive a dozen battles and then die from scratching yourself on a wooden table.
Modern doctors solve this problem with a pennyworth tablet of ascorbic acid. But in the Middle Ages, vitamins had not yet been discovered, and the lords tried to treat themselves with the usual methods. They ate even more expensive meat and drank even more wine, making their condition worse. It's like trying to put out a fire by throwing stacks of $100 bills at it. Wealth didn't matter if you didn't have sauerkraut or lemons on your menu. What was most unfortunate was that the commoners outside the castle walls sometimes suffered less from scurvy than the aristocrats. Why? Because the poor ate onions, garlic, and pickled vegetables, which the lords considered despicable food for commoners. The arrogance of the nobility literally killed them, depriving them of the only available source of a vital vitamin. The elite protein diet turned into a mechanism of slow and painful self-destruction. It is interesting to observe how history sometimes cruelly mocks people's social status. A knight in shining armor, feeding on pheasant and venison, rotted alive from vitamin deficiency, and a dirty peasant chewing sour cabbage in his hut had strong teeth and healthy gums. Modern nutritionists would laugh for a long time at this medieval inverted pyramid of healthy eating. Status dictated the menu, and the menu dictated who would live to see the next spring.
They sprinkled pepper and cloves on everything, thinking that this would restore the appetite of sick lords.
They sprinkled pepper and cloves on everything, thinking that this would restore the appetite of sick lords. But spices do not synthesize collagen. They only made the pain of chewing even more unbearable. This is a classic example of how medieval medicine fought the symptoms while completely ignoring the cause. They fought the shadow while the real killer quietly destroyed their bodies from within. It was only hundreds of years later that science officially proved the link between citrus fruits and the treatment of scurvy. Until then, every winter, stone fortresses were turned into hospitals for patients suffering from vitamin deficiency. People lost their teeth, their ability to walk, and ultimately their lives due to a simple chemical deficiency. And all this happened in halls hung with gold and expensive weapons. With the onset of severe cold weather, not only culinary but also hygienic habits changed radically in the castles. The inhabitants of the fortresses almost completely stopped washing, and they had ironclad logic for doing so. They were terrified of catching deadly pneumonia by undressing in icy, drafty rooms. And from their point of view, it was perfectly reasonable. Better to be dirty and alive than clean and dead. But this forced abandonment of hygiene opened the door to a completely different, no less terrible enemy. People put on multiple layers of thick woolen clothing and did not take them off for weeks or even months. This warm, damp, unwashed wool created an ideal five-star resort for the reproduction of body lice. And here lies the main problem. Lice themselves simply cause unpleasant itching, but these tiny parasites have historically been the main carriers of typhus bacteria. You try to protect yourself from the cold with layers of wool, but instead you wrap yourself in a biological weapon. Typhus is a terrible fever that spread at lightning speed in crowded conditions. Garrison soldiers slept in bunks, servants huddled around hearths, and lords sat side by side at cramped tables. Lice happily crawled from one person to another, generously spreading deadly bacteria throughout the castle. Modern epidemiologists would call a winter castle the perfect incubator for a pandemic. People themselves created the ideal ecosystem for their microscopic killer. It is interesting to note how the infection of this terrible disease occurred. Contrary to myth, lice do not inject typhus when they bite. The bacteria are contained in their excrement on human skin. When the bite began to itch, people instinctively scratched their skin, rubbing the infected excrement into their own micro-wounds. Sounds incredibly disgusting, right? But this mechanical chain killed more soldiers in history than all swords and arrows combined. The symptoms of typhus were terrifying. The temperature skyrocketed, a rash appeared on the body, and delirium set in. A person could burn up from fever in a matter of days, infecting a dozen of their comrades before doing so. Doctors of that time were again completely powerless and tried to treat patients with the same useless bloodletting. They thought that people had bad blood, not realizing that the problem was crawling around their own collars. This ignorance cost the lives of entire armies locked up in winter quarters. Today, typhus is treated with a simple course of antibiotics, and we have almost forgotten about its existence in developed countries. By modern medical standards, it is a common infection that can be treated by a regular therapist in a clinic. But for a medieval castle, it was a death sentence from which neither thick walls nor deep moats could save them. The enemy was already inside, hiding in the folds of the most expensive velvet robes. The most powerful people in Europe regularly lost the war to insects the size of sesame seeds. The scale of the disaster was such that typhus was sometimes called camp fever or prison disease. In winter, the castle was essentially a mixture of a military camp and a comfortable maximum security prison. People could not go anywhere because of the snow and frost, remaining hostages of their own dirty clothes. Even washing did not always help because nits survived well in cold water and waited for their moment. Boiling water was needed, but boiling huge vats of water in winter was incredibly expensive and difficult. Priests often explained these epidemics as God's punishment for the sins of the castle's inhabitants, and people believed praying fervently in cold chapels, standing shoulder to shoulder, and continuing to exchange parasites. No one understood that salvation did not require prayer, but simply boiling clothes thoroughly. This tragic lack of basic scientific knowledge cost humanity millions of senseless deaths. So the winter cold worked as the perfect accomplice for the typhus epidemic. It drove people into cramped quarters, forced them to wear the same clothes and refuse to wash. The fortress, which was supposed to serve as absolute protection, turned into a deadly trap for its defenders. We talk a lot about disease and food, but let's get back to the architecture of the castle itself. These fortresses were built of massive stone to withstand the blows of battering rams and the shots of trebuchets. Stone is an excellent material for defense, but from a thermodynamic point of view, it is an absolute disaster. Stone is an excellent conductor of cold, and in winter, these huge walls literally froze through. They ceased to be a defense and began to function as a giant, merciless glacier. When you are in a room with frozen stone walls, an interesting physical process occurs. The walls are not just cold to the touch, they actively draw heat from your body at a distance. Even if you are sitting by a huge blazing fireplace, your back remains turned to the icy stone. And this stone methodically, degree by degree, sucks the heat energy out of you. Modern civil engineers combat this phenomenon with layers of high-quality insulation. But medieval lords had only thin decorative tapestries on the walls instead of fiberglass. The tapestries helped, but they couldn't stop physics. People constantly lost heat while indoors. As a result, people regularly suffered from severe hypothermia without even going outside. Kidney inflammation, fatal pneumonia, and severe sciatica were were occupational diseases of the castle nobility. You sit in your throne room, and your lower back slowly turns into a block of ice. It was because of this architectural feature that the famous medieval furniture we so often see in museums appeared. Those very massive wooden chairs with unnaturally high and solid backs, similar to thrones. Why did they need such huge backs? It wasn't just a design for grandeur or to show off the lord's status to his subjects. It was a functional wooden shield that protected the sitter's back from the icy breath of the stone wall behind them. In essence, they were portable wooden insulators, an attempt to create a microclimate around a single person. It sounds ingenious, but imagine how cold the room must have been for you to need a personal shield from the wall. In a modern office, you would simply quit on the first day at such a temperature. Medieval kings considered this a normal working environment and simply put on another fur cape. This furniture is silent testimony to how hostile the environment was inside their own homes. But even chairs did not save your feet, because the stone floors also froze to the point of becoming ice. To insulate the floor in some way, it was generously covered with a thick layer of dry straw or reeds. The straw provided a little insulation, but it quickly became infested with fleas and mice, and rotting dirt accumulated in it. You try to save your feet from frostbite, but instead you get a smelly zoo right under your boots. It's a constant choice between two absolute evils, where both options are trying to kill you. Today, a thermal imager would show that a medieval castle in winter was one huge black hole in terms of temperature. Fireplaces created only tiny islands of warmth, beyond which the Arctic zone began. Moving from one room to another along the corridor required the same preparation as going outside. Servants who had to constantly run through these icy tunnels were the first to die of colds. The castle did not protect them from winter. It simply concentrated winter within its impregnable walls. It is amazing how much energy these people spent just to maintain their basic body temperature. A significant portion of the thousands of calories they consumed at dinner went exclusively to heating their bodies. Modern people in heated apartments spend far fewer physiological resources on this. Their bodies work themselves to exhaustion, trying to compensate for the architectural shortcomings of the military engineers of the time. During the warm season, castle dwellers could draw water from rivers, streams, or external sources. But in winter, when everything around was frozen, the only reliable source of moisture was the castle's internal well. This well was the heart of the fortress, its strategic reserve in case of a long siege or harsh winter. And it often became the cause of mass and incredibly painful deaths from intestinal infections. To understand the reason, we will have to look into the medieval sewage system. The toilets in castles, elegantly called wardrobes, were stone shafts built directly into the walls. Waste flew down these shafts and accumulated at the base of the walls or in the castle moat. During heavy thaws, meltwater mixed with these wastes, turning into a highly toxic biological solution, and due to poor insulation of the foundation, this slurry could slowly seep through the soil directly into the groundwater. And where did that strategic castle well get its water? That's right, from the same groundwater. People literally drank water poisoned by their own excrement without even suspecting it. This led to horrific outbreaks of dysentery and cholera, which wiped out the castle's population in a matter of weeks. The bacteria entered the body, causing severe diarrhea, dehydration, and a painful death within a couple of days. Modern treatment facilities and filtration systems make such a scenario virtually impossible in our cities. But for a medieval castle, it was a standard architectural defect that cost thousands of lives. The most frightening thing is that well water could look completely clean and clear at first glance. Bacteria have no color or smell, so the guards continued to draw buckets of deadly poison for the Lord's kitchen. Cooks used this water to make soups, dilute wine, and serve it to distinguished guests. A castle capable of withstanding artillery fire from trebuchets fell because of microscopic bacteria in a glass of water. This is a classic example of how ignorance of microbiology turned engineering into a weapon of mass destruction. Many lords intuitively understood that raw water was dangerous, so they tried to drink low-alcohol beer or wine. The fermentation process and alcohol content did indeed kill some of the dangerous bacteria, making the drink safer than well water. It sounds like a great excuse for drunkenness, but in fact it was a harsh survival strategy. The Lord's children also drank diluted beer because giving a child raw water meant signing their death warrant. Today we consider alcoholism a problem, but back then it was a way to avoid dying of dysentery. However, there was not always enough beer and wine for the entire huge garrison and all the servants of the fortress. Ordinary soldiers were forced to drink well water, becoming the first victims of infection during thaws. When an epidemic began, doctors attributed it to miasmas, bad air rising from rotting waste. They burned incense in the rooms of the sick, while they continued to drink bacteria-contaminated water from jugs. Treating an intestinal infection with the smell of incense is like treating a broken bone with the power of thought. Interestingly, the ancient Romans understood the importance of clean water and built separate aqueducts and sewers. But in the Middle Ages, this knowledge was partially lost, and architects often made fatal mistakes in their planning. They could design the perfect arrow slit for archery, but they failed to meet basic sanitary standards. As a result, castles became traps where people poisoned themselves with their own waste products. Death from dysentery was one of the most inglorious and painful for a noble knight. You prepare to fall in battle, covered in glory, but instead you die of dehydration on dirty straw. Winter only exacerbated the problem as the cold lowered immunity and the frozen ground prevented normal water filtration. Now let's talk about the most paradoxical way to die in an icy, frozen medieval castle in winter. Oddly enough, one of the main causes of high mortality among the nobility during the cold season was fire. We already know that bedrooms were freezing, and lying down in an icy bed was a real torture for the body. To solve this problem, servants came up with the idea of using bed warmers, copper braziers on long handles filled with hot coals. The idea was to run this hot pan between the sheets and warm up the bed before going to sleep. In theory, it sounds like a brilliant invention, a true medieval analog of a modern electric blanket. But in practice, this device regularly turned the Lord's bedrooms into blazing fire traps. Beds at that time were stuffed with incredibly flammable materials, dry straw, down feather beds, and thick fabric. The slightest carelessness on the part of a servant, a tiny ember falling out of a brazier, or simply an overheated metal hot water bottle, dry canopies and mattresses burst into flames like gunpowder, instantly engulfing the entire huge wooden bed in flames. Imagine sleeping wrapped in 5 layers of heavy fur, and suddenly your bed catches fire. While you try to get out from under those heavy blankets, the fire spreads to the tapestries and wooden floors. In a modern home, the fire alarm would go off and the materials would be treated with fire-retardant compounds. In a medieval castle, you would have literally seconds to escape being burned alive in your own bedroom. The irony of fate. You were so afraid of freezing that you ended up roasting in your own bed. This problem was so widespread that fires caused by hot water bottles claimed the lives of entire dynasties across Europe. The bedrooms of the nobility were often located on the upper floors of the keep, where it was incredibly difficult to quickly deliver water for extinguishing fires. Wooden staircases burned, cutting off people's only escape route, and the stone tower turned into a red-hot furnace. Architecture designed to protect against enemy armies left no chance of escaping a domestic fire. My back chills at the thought of how dangerous a simple attempt to warm the sheets was. It is interesting to compare this with the modern world, where we leave heaters on all night. We trust thermostats and fuses, knowing that the system will shut itself down at the slightest overheating. The servant with the copper brazier had no safeguards other than his own fatigue and attentiveness. And a tired servant working 16 hours a day is not the most reliable fire safety system. One wrong move of a tired hand, and the history of an entire county would end in a cloud of smoke. Later, the design of the heaters began to be improved, with tight-fitting lids with tiny holes for ventilation. But the coals inside still had to receive oxygen, which meant that the risk of sparks flying out remained. Some lords tried to use heated stones or bricks instead of coals, which was much safer. But the stones cooled too quickly, and wealthy aristocrats still returned to dangerous but hot coals. The desire for comfort always outweighed common sense, even under the threat of a painful, fiery death. This paradox of survival in a castle perfectly illustrates the absurdity of medieval life in winter. People built incredible stone citadels costing entire fortunes to protect themselves from danger. And then they brought hot coals into their beds, balancing on the brink of disaster every night. Winter meant that there would be no fresh meat for months, as it was too expensive to feed livestock until spring. In the fall, castles carried out mass slaughter, and cooks were faced with the enormous task of preserving tons of meat until spring. Modern refrigerators did not exist, so preservation methods boiled down to heavy salting in barrels or aggressive smoking. In theory, salt draws out moisture and prevents bacteria from multiplying, keeping the product edible. But in practice, it was an incredibly risky process, where the slightest mistake led to disaster. If the salt was not of sufficient quality, or the pieces of meat were too thick and did not dry out properly inside, the preservative could not reach the depths of these chunks of meat. Where anaerobic decay began and botulism developed. Botulinum toxin is one of the most dangerous and deadly neurotoxins known to modern science. Even a microscopic dose of this poison causes paralysis of the respiratory muscles and rapid, irreversible death. And this poison matured right in the Lord's storerooms while winter blizzards howled outside the walls. The problem was that slightly spoiled meat was not thrown away in the Middle Ages. Throwing food away in winter was madness, so cooks used a cunning but deadly culinary trick. They generously seasoned the meat that was beginning to rot with expensive Oriental spices, herbs, and strong sauces. The spices masked the smell of decay, and the Lord happily ate his dinner, unaware of the danger. The cook thought he was simply saving the castle's budget, but in reality, he was serving a deadly biological poison. Modern food technologists know that heat treatment kills botulism bacteria when done correctly. But the toxin that bacteria have already produced in meat is extremely resistant to conventional medieval baking. You can roast that piece of boar on a spit until it's golden brown, but the toxin will still remain inside. When people began to suffocate from paralysis, doctors once again threw up their hands and diagnosed internal heat, or the evil eye. They couldn't even imagine that the cause of death lay in that very expensive barrel of salted venison. Sounds like the plot of a crime thriller about poisoning, right? Only here there was no malicious intent. The food preparation system itself was Russian roulette. Today we throw away sausage with disgust if it is even one day past its expiration date. Medieval garrisons ate meat for months that was on the verge of turning into a chemical weapon. Their stomachs were tough, but even they couldn't handle pure neurotoxin. Interestingly, spices were worth a fortune back then, with pepper literally valued at the weight of gold. The Lord spent a fortune to mask the taste of rot, which ultimately killed him. This is the highest degree of historical irony. Your wealth allows you to buy a spice to eat poison unnoticed. The poor, who did not have money for pepper, immediately smelled the stench of spoiled meat and simply did not eat it. Their poverty literally served as a built-in food safety system. Mortality from botulism and severe food poisoning peaked in the second half of winter. Supplies were running low, food quality was falling to critical levels, and people's immunity was undermined by the cold. Every dinner in the Great Hall could be the last for anyone who dared to eat a piece of old ham. This proves once again that in a medieval castle, the danger came not from enemy swords, but from the dinner plate. Survival depended on luck and how deeply the salt had penetrated a piece of pork 5 months earlier. We have discussed air, water, food, and cold, but there is another less obvious factor in medieval winter. Castle windows were not designed for admiring the scenery. They were narrow loopholes for shooting crossbows. They let in critically little daylight even on clear summer days, and in winter the sun rarely showed itself anyway. Moreover, to protect themselves from the icy drafts, these loopholes were tightly closed with heavy wooden shutters. As a result, the castle's inhabitants were plunged into months of bleak, oppressive gloom, lit only by the dim light of candles and hearths. This constant artificial gloom had disastrous consequences for health, primarily an acute vitamin D deficiency. Modern medicine knows that vitamin D is synthesized in the skin under the influence of direct sunlight. Without it, our bodies simply lose the ability to absorb calcium normally, leading to bone destruction. Adult lords and servants suffered from severe depression, chronic fatigue, and increased bone fragility. A slight fall on a stone floor, which in summer would have resulted in a bruise, led to complex fractures in winter. But the real tragedy of this lack of sunlight was for the children of the lords, who grew up in these stone crypts. Due to a total deficiency of vitamin D during their active growth period, they developed severe, irreversible rickets. Their bones became soft and pliable. Their legs bent under the weight of their own bodies, forming a characteristic skeletal deformity. Today, rickets is rare in developed countries, and doctors prescribe vitamin D drops to children as a preventive measure. But back then, the heirs of great empires grew up disabled with crooked legs simply because they were kept safe in the castle. Think about this paradox. A lord hides his children behind 3-meter-thick walls to protect them from enemy arrows and kidnappers. He provides them with the best protection that money can buy in the Middle Ages. And in the end, this ultra-secure architecture crippled their bodies more effectively than any enemy. Poor peasant children, running around outside in ragged clothes in winter, got more sun and had stronger bones. The safety of the castle literally deformed the skeletons of those it was supposed to protect. In addition to bone problems, the lack of sunlight greatly undermined the overall immunity of all the inhabitants of the fortress. Vitamin D plays a vital role in the functioning of our immune system, helping the body fight infections. Combined with scurvy and cold, this deficiency turned people into easy targets for any random bacteria. A common winter cold quickly turned into fatal pneumonia because the body simply did not have the resources to fight it. They did not die of old age. They died because they had not seen normal daylight for months. Doctors at the time, of course, knew nothing about ultraviolet light and vitamin synthesis in the epidermis. They attributed winter melancholy to an excess of black bile in the body and again prescribed cleansing procedures. You are depressed because of a lack of sunlight, and the doctor suggests letting your blood to lift your spirits. It sounds like sophisticated torture, but it was the standard medical protocol of the best specialists of the era. It was not until the 20th century that scientists fully understood the mechanics of sunlight's effect on calcium metabolism, and medieval aristocrats continued to pay a terrible price for their love of massive defensive architecture. Winter in a castle was not just a cold season, it was a period of biological hibernation in conditions of acute chemical deprivation, and not everyone survived this hibernation. The final blow dealt by the winter castle was perhaps the most painful and unexpected of all. How could an ordinary tooth cause the death of a healthy, trained knight? It all starts with the technology of bread production, which we have already discussed in the context of fungal poisoning. In those days, flour was ground on huge stone millstones, which inevitably crumbled during the process. As a result, each loaf of bread always contained an admixture of fine stone dust and tiny grains of sand. This daily dose of sand acted like sandpaper, catastrophically quickly wearing down the enamel on the teeth of the castle's inhabitants. By the age of 30, many people's teeth were worn down almost to the gums, exposing the sensitive nerve. At normal times, this caused only intense pain when chewing, which people simply learned to live with. But in winter, against the backdrop of weakened immunity, vitamin deficiency, and the onset of scurvy, the situation spiraled out of control. A normal worn tooth quickly and inevitably turned into a huge purulent abscess in the jaw. Today, if your cheek swells up, you go to the dentist, who cleans the canal and prescribes a course of antibiotics. Medieval knights did not have antibiotics, and the local barber could only offer to pull out the tooth with rusty pliers. In winter, any wound in the mouth healed poorly due to the lack of vitamin C, which we mentioned earlier. The infection from the inflamed gums easily entered the bloodstream and began its journey through the weakened body, and that's when there was no turning back. From the jaw to the brain, just a few centimeters through the straight blood vessels of the neck. The purulent infection quickly spread to the brain, causing meningitis, or led to general sepsis of the body. A huge warrior in armor, capable of cutting a man in half, lay feverish and dying because of a tiny hole in his tooth. This is an absurd but absolutely real picture of mortality in medieval fortresses during the winter. Stone dust from your bread methodically prepared the ground for a deadly bacterial attack. Once again, we see how a person's status worked against them in this mad race for survival. The nobility ate more finely ground bread, but even that contained this invisible stone death. Moreover, the lords loved sweets, honey, and dried fruit. which only accelerated the decay process in their worn teeth. Their wealth allowed them to buy foods that killed their teeth even faster than the food of the common people. There were no dentists, only the brute physical force of a blacksmith or barber with forceps. Imagine this level of despair. You are surrounded by thick walls. You have basements full of food. You are safe from enemies. And you die screaming in pain because a million grains of sand have worn away your tooth enamel over the years. This shows how fragile the human body was before the advent of modern antibiotic therapy. Winter simply pulled the trigger, finishing off the immune system and allowing infections to complete what they had started. This whole survival system was like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest draft. Every technical achievement of the castle, walls, wells, fireplaces, meat supplies, had its deadly downside. And that is why winter was the most terrible enemy, always penetrating any fortress walls. Now you understand why medieval castles in winter were not romantic palaces, but brutal training grounds for survival. Every detail of daily life, from a piece of bread in a stone wall to a warming brazier bed, posed a deadly threat. People struggled with carbon monoxide, rotten food, parasites in their own teeth, and many lost that battle. The modern world has given us warmth, clean water, and antibiotics, making us incredibly spoiled by historical standards. So today, as you lie down in a warm bed in a heated apartment, just say thank you to modern engineering and medicine. You survived today only because you were born at the right time.